Atreides used atomics against the shield wall at Arrakis. Kwisatz Haderach, the prescient consciousness, the Fremen Messiah, the claimant to the imperial throne, deployed the weapons the Great Convention prohibited against the geological formation whose destruction the Fremen assault required. The weapons detonated, the shield wall was breached, the Fremen army poured through the breach. The battle was won. The Imperium changed hands. The deployment was a violation. The Great Convention, the interstellar civilization's most foundational agreement about the limits of violence, prohibited the use of atomics against human targets. Paul deployed the atomics against the geological formation rather than against the personnel the formation protected. The distinction was the argument, was the legal and the political case that the deployment did not violate the Convention's prohibition, because the deployment's target was the rock rather than the persons. The argument was thin. The deployment's purpose was the breach. The breach's purpose was the assault. The assault's target was the personnel the breach provided access to. The atomics were deployed to enable the killing the assault would produce. The distinction between targeting the rock and targeting the persons the rock's destruction enabled the killing of was the distinction the political landscape would have to assess, and that the revolution's military success would render the assessment moot. The deployment was the Great Convention's most dramatic test, the moment at which the prohibition's boundary was most visibly challenged, the event through which the Convention's authority was most dramatically questioned. The test illuminated everything about the Convention, revealed what the Convention prohibited, why the prohibition existed, how the prohibition was enforced, and what happened when the enforcement's mechanisms were overwhelmed by the military and the political realities the prohibition could not contain. This is the story of the Great Convention and the forbidden weapons of Dune. The story of the agreement the civilization made about the violence the civilization could not tolerate. The story of the weapons the agreement prohibited and the consequences the agreement's violation produced. The story of the boundary between the warfare the political competition required and the destruction the civilization's survival demanded the warfare not encompass. The Great Convention was not a single document. The Convention was the accumulated body of agreements, understandings, and enforced prohibitions that the Imperium's political actors had developed across the millennia of the interstellar civilization's institutional history. The Convention was organic, was the product of the civilization's sustained negotiation about the violence's acceptable limits, rather than the product of a single founding moment's constitutional drafting. The Convention's core prohibition was the prohibition against the use of atomics against human targets. The prohibition was absolute, was maintained without the exceptions, the qualifications, the circumstantial modifications that lesser prohibitions might have included. The absoluteness was the prohibition's most consequential quality, the quality that made the prohibition the Convention's most serious commitment, and the prohibition's violation the Convention's most serious breach. The prohibition existed because the weapons existed. The noble houses of the Landsraad, the political actors whose competitive dynamics the feudal framework structure sustained, maintained the family atomics. The atomic weapons were the house's most powerful military assets, the destructive capabilities whose deployment would have produced the devastation the conventional warfare's methods could not match. The atomics were present. The atomics were maintained. The atomics were not used. The presence, the maintenance, and the non-use were all the Convention's products, were all the elements of the agreement the Convention constituted about the weapons the agreement encompassed. The Convention said, "The weapons may be maintained." The convention said the weapons may not be used against human targets. The maintenance and the non-use coexisted, were both the convention's mandated conditions, were both the agreement's specified terms. The coexistence was the convention's deterrent architecture. The houses that maintained the atomics were the houses whose retaliation the aggressor's atomic use would have triggered. The aggressor who used the atomics against a house would have faced the retaliation of every other house, would have confronted the collective response the convention's mutual enforcement mechanism guaranteed. The retaliation would have been atomic. The retaliation would have been comprehensive. The aggressor who violated the convention would have been destroyed by the response the violation triggered. The deterrent was the convention's enforcement. The prohibition was not enforced through the central authority the governance's judicial mechanisms provided, was not maintained through the courts, the tribunals, the adjudicative processes the governance's legal framework encompassed. The prohibition was enforced through the deterrent, through the mutual assurance that the violation's consequences would exceed the violation's benefits by the margin the retaliation's comprehensiveness produced. The deterrent worked. The atomics were not used against human targets during the millennia the convention's enforcement encompassed. The non-use was the deterrent's product, was generated by the mutual assurance the convention's enforcement architecture sustained, was maintained by the retaliation's credibility the mutual maintenance of the atomic arsenals provided. The working was the convention's achievement. The civilization that maintained the weapons whose destructive capability could have annihilated populations and devastated worlds managed to sustain the non-use across the millennia the civilization's political history encompassed. The management was the convention, was the agreement whose terms the deterrent sustained, was the arrangement whose enforcement the mutual retaliation guaranteed. The family atomics were the weapons the convention was organized around, the destructive devices the noble houses maintained as the deterrent's material foundation. The atomics were nuclear. The weapon's destructive mechanism was the nuclear reaction, the atomic process whose energy release produced the devastation the weapon's deployment would generate. The mechanism was ancient, was the technology the pre-Imperium civilization had developed, was the destructive capability the human species' technological history had produced long before the Imperium's political framework had been established. The atomics were maintained by each house. The weapons were not centralized, were not held by the Emperor, the Landsraad's collective authority, or any institutional body the governance's architecture encompassed. The weapons were distributed, were maintained by the individual houses whose political positions the feudal framework structure included, were held by the political actors whose competitive dynamics the framework sustained. The distribution was the convention's foundation. The deterrent that the convention's enforcement depended on was the deterrent the distribution's mutual character produced. Every house had the weapons. Every house was deterred from using the weapons by every other house's possession of the weapons. The mutual possession was the mutual deterrence. The mutual deterrence was the convention's enforcement. The distribution was also the convention's vulnerability. The weapons that were distributed across the houses' individual arsenals were the weapons whose individual houses control the governance's central authority could not fully manage. The houses maintained the weapons independently, managed the arsenal's security, determined the arsenal's condition, controlled the deployment's authorization through the house's individual governance rather than through the civilization's collective authority. The independent control meant the individual house's decision. The deployment authorization, the determination of whether the atomics would be used, was the individual house's determination rather than the collective authority's determination. The individual determination was the convention's most consequential vulnerability. The vulnerability that the individual house's assessment of the deployment's justification could produce the violation the collective authority's assessment would not have authorized. Paul's deployment was the vulnerability's realization. The individual house, the Atreides, operating through the Fremen military structure Paul commanded, deployed the atomics through the individual determination the house's authority encompassed. The determination was Paul's, was the prescient consciousness's assessment of the deployment's necessity, rather than the Landsraad's collective assessment of the deployment's authorization. The individual determination produced the violation. The violation the collective authority would not have authorized was the violation the individual authority did authorize. The discrepancy between the individual and the collective was the convention's vulnerability expressed. The gap between the individual house's assessment and the collective authority's prohibition that the convention's enforcement architecture could not close. The convention's origins were connected to the Butlerian Jihad's aftermath. To the post-Jihad settlement's establishment of the political framework, the Imperium's subsequent history would be conducted within. The Jihad's destruction had demonstrated the technology's potential for the civilization's devastation. The generations spanning war against the thinking machines had produced the destruction whose scale demonstrated the weapon's capability for the devastation the civilization's continued existence could not accommodate. The demonstration was the lesson, was the historical experience that informed the settlement's architect's determination that the weapon's unrestricted use was the condition the civilization's survival required the prohibition of. The determination was the convention's motivation. The architects who established the post-Jihad political framework, who designed the institutional architecture the Imperium's governance would operate within, included the convention's prohibitions in the framework's design, because the Jihad's destruction had demonstrated the need for the prohibitions the convention constituted. The need was existential. The weapons whose unrestricted use the convention prohibited were the weapons whose unrestricted use would have threatened the civilization's continued existence. The threat was not theoretical, was not the speculative possibility the academic assessment might have produced. The threat was demonstrated, was shown by the Jihad's destruction, was evidenced by the devastation the technology's deployment had generated during the war the Jihad constituted. The convention was the civilization's response to the demonstration. The response said the weapon's unrestricted use threatens the civilization. The civilization prohibits the unrestricted use. The prohibition protects the civilization from the threat the unrestricted use would produce. The response was rational. The civilization that had experienced the destruction, that had witnessed the devastation the weapon's deployment produced, was the civilization whose rational assessment concluded that the weapon's prohibition was necessary for the civilization's survival. The rationality was the convention's intellectual foundation, was the assessment that justified the prohibition through the reasoning the demonstrated threat's evidence supported. The response was also emotional. The Jihad's destruction had produced the trauma, the civilizational experience of the devastation that the trauma's psychological dimensions encompassed. The trauma's emotional content informed the prohibition's emotional support, provided the conviction the prohibition's maintenance required alongside the reasoning the prohibition's intellectual foundation supplied. The rational and the emotional combined to produce the convention's durability. The prohibition that was both rational and emotionally supported was the prohibition whose maintenance was sustained by both the reasoning's conclusion and the conviction's commitment. The combination was the durability's source, the mechanism through which the Convention's enforcement was maintained across the millennia the civilization's political history encompassed. The lasgun shield interaction was the Convention's second most consequential weapons-related dimension, the destructive phenomenon whose tactical implications shaped the Imperium's warfare's character alongside the atomic prohibition's strategic implications. The interaction was a physics problem made military. The lasgun, the energy weapon the Imperium's military forces deployed for the directed energy attacks the combat's tactical requirements encompassed, interacted with the Holtzman shield in ways the interaction's destructive consequences made consequential. The lasgun beam's contact with the active shield produced the nuclear-scale explosion, the detonation whose destructive force approached the atomic weapon's destructive capability through the physics the interaction generated. The explosion destroyed both the attacker and the defender. The lasgun operator whose weapon contacted the shield and the shield wearer whose defense the lasgun contacted were both destroyed by the explosion the interaction produced. The mutual destruction was the interaction's most consequential tactical quality, the quality that made the interaction the engagement whose outcome was the annihilation of both participants rather than the victory of one. The mutual destruction produced the tactical prohibition. The Convention's formal prohibition against the atomic weapons was supplemented by the tactical prohibition against the lasgun shield interaction, the operational avoidance that the mutual destruction's consequences imposed on the military forces whose tactical planning the interaction's physics informed. The avoidance was not codified, was not inscribed in the Convention's formal prohibitions alongside the atomic prohibition. The avoidance was practical, was imposed by the interaction's consequences rather than by the agreement's terms. The practical avoidance shaped the warfare. The military forces that avoided the lasgun shield interaction were the forces whose tactical operations were conducted without the directed energy attacks against the shielded targets the interaction's avoidance excluded. The exclusion changed the warfare's character, removed the directed energy engagement against the shielded defender from the tactical repertoire the military planning encompassed, restricted the combat options the tactical assessment could deploy. The restriction was comprehensive. The shield was ubiquitous, was the personal defense the Imperium's military personnel routinely employed, was the protection the combat's participants standardly maintained. The lasgun was available, was the directed energy weapon the military forces' arsenals standardly included. The ubiquity and the availability meant the interaction was possible in every engagement, meant the destructive consequence the interaction produced was the potential present in every combat the shielded personnel and the lasgun-equipped forces participated in. The potential's presence was the avoidance's motivation. The military planners, whose tactical assessments encompassed the engagement's options, assessed the lasgun shield interaction's potential as the risk the engagement's benefits could not justify. The assessment was rational, concluded that the mutual destruction the interaction produced was the outcome the tactical objectives could not warrant, that the annihilation of both forces was the result the combat's competitive purpose could not accommodate. The avoidance produced the blade combat. The military forces whose tactical options the lasgun shield interaction's avoidance restricted were the forces whose combat methods the restriction redirected toward the blade. Toward the close quarters combat the edged weapons the shield's limitations permitted. The shield slowed the fast-moving objects, was the defense whose filtration characteristics admitted the slow-moving penetrations the blade combat's technique exploited. The slow blade penetrated the shield. The technique The combat method the shield's physical characteristics required was the method the military forces developed for the shielded opponent's engagement. The technique was skilled, required the training the blade combat's precision demanded, required the ability the slow blade's controlled movement the shield's penetration encompassed. The technique shaped the martial traditions. The Imperium's military cultures, the combat traditions the noble houses maintained, the martial arts the military training developed were shaped by the blade combat, the lasgun shield interactions avoidance, and the shield's filtration characteristics produced. The traditions were blade-focused, were organized around the edged weapon's employment. The slow blade's technique, the close quarters engagement the blade combat constituted. The Fremen were different. The desert people's combat tradition developed in the conditions the desert imposed and the sandworm ecology maintained was the tradition the shield's absence had shaped. The Fremen did not use shields. The shields attracted the sandworms. The Holtzman effect's operation produced the stimuli the worm's sensory perception detected, drawing the organisms toward the shielded person with the aggressive response the attraction generated. The shield's absence changed the Fremen's combat tradition. The martial art the shield's absence produced was the art the unshielded combat required. The fighting form the opponent's unshielded condition permitted, the technique the unshielded body's vulnerability demanded. The Fremen's combat was faster, was conducted at the speeds the shield's absence did not restrict, was performed at the velocities the unshielded engagement permitted. The faster combat was the Fremen's tactical advantage when the Fremen encountered the shielded opponents. The Fremen's speed, developed through the combat tradition the shield's absence had shaped, exceeded the speed the shielded opponent's training had prepared the shielded opponent for. The speed advantage was the ecology's martial contribution, the combat capability the shield's absence, imposed by the sandworm's attraction, had developed in the desert warriors the absence encompassed. The stone burner was the weapon whose placement in the convention's framework was ambiguous, the device whose destructive mechanism raised the question of whether the device was encompassed by the convention's atomic prohibition or whether the device occupied the space the prohibition's language did not clearly address. The stone burner was a subatomic weapon. The device's destructive mechanism operated through the subatomic processes the device's engineering employed. Through the reactions the device's design initiated at the subatomic level, the device's operational physics encompassed. The mechanism was nuclear in the broadest sense, was the energy released the atomic and the subatomic processes generated through the reactions the device's engineering produced. The device's effects included the radiation. The stone burner's deployment produced the radiation, whose effects included the biological damage the radiation's interaction with the human physiology generated. The radiation's most consequential biological effect was the effect on the visual organs, the destruction of the eyes the radiation's interaction with the ocular physiology produced. The radiation blinded. The stone burner's deployment in the vicinity of the human population produced the blindness, the destruction of the visual capability the radiation's biological effects generated in the persons the radiation's range encompassed. The blindness was the device's most documented effect, the consequence the saga's narrative documented through the deployment's effects on Paul's visual organs during the events the Dune Messiah narrative encompassed. Paul was blinded by the stone burner. The device's deployment during the conspiracy's events produced the radiation whose effects destroyed Paul's eyes. The blindness was permanent, was the irreversible destruction of the visual organs the radiation's biological effects generated. The blindness was the stone burner's most personally consequential documented effect, The consequence, the device's deployment, produced in the person, the deployment's effects encompassed. The Stoneburner's relationship with the convention was the relationship the device's ambiguous status produced in the prohibition framework's legal dimension. The convention prohibited the atomics. The Stoneburner was subatomic. The distinction between the atomic and the subatomic was the distinction the convention's language's interpretation encompassed. The determination of whether the prohibition's scope included the subatomic devices alongside the atomic devices the prohibition's language addressed. The ambiguity was not resolved in the saga's documented texts with the definitiveness the ambiguity's significance warranted. The question of whether the stone burner was a convention violation was the question the texts presented without the definitive answer the question's adjudication would have required. The ambiguity persisted, was maintained as the open question the convention's legal dimension encompassed. The ambiguity was the convention's limitation. The agreement whose prohibition was absolute in the atomic dimension was the agreement whose prohibition was ambiguous in the subatomic dimension. The absoluteness and the ambiguity coexisted in the same framework, were both the convention's qualities, were both the agreement's characteristics. The absoluteness protected the civilization from the atomic weapons. The ambiguity left the civilization uncertain about the subatomic weapons. Biological weapons occupied the convention's framework alongside the atomic and the subatomic, were encompassed by the prohibition's broader dimensions alongside the nuclear weapons the prohibition's core prohibition addressed. The convention's scope extended beyond the atomics. The agreement's prohibitions encompassed the weapons of mass destruction the civilization's technological capability had produced, encompassed the biological weapons, the chemical weapons, the technologies whose destructive capability the mass casualty character constituted. The biological weapons prohibition was the prohibition whose enforcement was complicated by the biological weapons' covert character. The atomic weapons were visible, were the devices whose maintenance the intelligence apparatus could detect, whose deployment the monitoring systems could identify, whose presence the surveillance the mutual deterrence required could track. The biological weapons were invisible, were the agents whose development the laboratory conditions concealed, whose deployment the delivery mechanisms disguised, whose presence the detection system's methodologies could not reliably identify. The invisibility complicated the enforcement. The deterrent that enforced the atomic prohibition, the mutual assurance that the violation would trigger the retaliation the mutual possession guaranteed, was the deterrent whose operation required the violation's detection. The atomic violation could be detected, the detonation's physical effects were detectable, the deployment's observational signatures were identifiable. The biological violation might not be detected, the agent's deployment's effects might be attributed to the natural disease rather than to the weapon. The weapon's delivery might not produce the observational signatures the detection required. The detection's difficulty was the biological prohibition's most consequential enforcement challenge, the prohibition that could not be reliably enforced through the detection the deterrence operation required, was the prohibition whose maintenance depended on the factors the detection's difficulty did not address, depended on the moral commitment, the institutional restraint, the cultural prohibition the convention's broader framework sustained. The broader framework's enforcement was softer than the deterrence enforcement. The moral commitment that the biological prohibition depended on, the cultural prohibition that the biological weapon's non-use was sustained by, was the enforcement whose reliability was less assured than the deterrence enforcement the atomic prohibition's mutual retaliation provided. The softness was the biological prohibition's most consequential quality. the quality that made the biological prohibition's maintenance more dependent on the voluntary compliance than the atomic prohibition's maintenance was. The Bene Tleilax operated in the biological prohibition's ambiguous space. The faction whose biological capabilities included the genetic engineering, the face dancer production, the Gola technology, the axolotl tanks generated, was the faction whose institutional activities occupied the space between the biological weapons prohibition and the biological capabilities permitted development. The space was ambiguous. The Convention's biological prohibition addressed the weapons, addressed the agents whose deployment was designed for the mass casualty effects the weapons constituted. The Tleilaxu biological capabilities were not weapons in the mass casualty sense, were not the agents whose deployment was designed for the population-level destruction the biological weapons prohibition encompassed. The capabilities were biological technologies, were the engineered biological products the Tleilax's institutional purposes generated for the institutional functions the products served. The distinction between the biological weapons and the biological technologies was the distinction the Convention's biological dimension encompassed. The weapons were prohibited. The technologies were permitted. The boundary between the weapons and the technologies was the boundary the Convention's framework had to manage, the boundary whose location the institutional activities assessment determined and whose maintenance the enforcement mechanisms addressed. The boundary was difficult to maintain. The biological technologies whose development the Convention's framework permitted were the technologies whose capabilities might encompass the weapons' effects, whose products might be deployable for the purposes the weapons prohibition addressed. The face dancer's infiltration capability, the Gola technology's personality replacement, the axolotl tank's biological production. All were capabilities whose military and the political applications the Convention's framework had to assess against the biological prohibition's scope. The Canley framework was the Convention's regulated warfare dimension, the framework within which the noble house's competitive violence was conducted within the parameters the Convention's regulation specified. Canley was the formal feud. The term described the institutional arrangement through which the noble house's competitive conflicts, the rivalries, the disputes, the hostilities, the feudal frameworks, competitive dynamics generated, were conducted within the regulated parameters the Convention specified. The regulation was the Canley's most consequential quality. The Canley did not prohibit the warfare. The Canley regulated the warfare, specified the conditions under which the competitive violence was conducted, determined the parameters within which the military engagements the feudal dynamics produced were maintained, established the limits the competitive aggression was contained within. The limits were the Convention's warfare-related contribution. The Convention that prohibited the atomic weapons also regulated the conventional weapons, also specified the conditions the conventional warfare's conduct was maintained within, also established the parameters the competitive violence's deployment was contained by. The regulation included the targeting. The Canley's framework specified the targets the competitive violence could be directed against, specified the combatants whose engagement the warfare legitimately encompassed, excluded the non-combatants whose protection the framework's humanitarian dimension provided. The specification was the Convention's distinction between the combatants and the non-combatants, the determination of whom the competitive violence could legitimately target and whom the competitive violence was required to exclude. The distinction was consequential. The warfare that targeted the combatants, that directed the competitive violence against the military forces, the political leadership, the institutional operatives the rivalry's conflict encompassed, was the warfare the Canley's framework authorized. the warfare that targeted the non-combatants, that directed the competitive violence against the civilian populations the rivalries, conflicts, consequences encompassed, was the warfare the Canley's framework prohibited. The prohibition was not always observed. The competitive dynamics the feudal framework generated produced the pressures the prohibition's maintenance had to sustain. The temptations the competitive advantages pursuit generated to exceed the prohibition's boundaries, the incentives the rivalry's intensity created to violate the targeting's restrictions. The Harkonnen governance of Arrakis operated at the Canley framework's boundary. The Baron's treatment of the Arrakis population, the oppressive governance the two-phase plan's first phase required, was the treatment whose character the Canley framework's humanitarian provisions should have constrained. The treatment exceeded the Canley's parameters, imposed the conditions on the civilian population the framework's non-combatant protections should have prevented. The exceeding was the framework's enforcement's limitation. The Canley that regulated the warfare's targeting was the framework whose enforcement depended on the political landscape's monitoring, on the Landsraad's observation, the Emperor's adjudication. The institutional mechanisms the enforcement's operation required. The monitoring was imperfect, was conducted with the coverage the institutional apparatus provided, rather than with the comprehensive surveillance the perfect enforcement would have demanded. The imperfection was the framework's gap. The warfare whose targeting the framework regulated was the warfare whose targeting's compliance the monitoring's imperfection could not fully verify. The gap between the regulation and the verification was the space the violations occupied, the space within which the competitive violence exceeded the framework's parameters without the exceedance's detection the enforcement required. The War of Assassins was the Canley's most concentrated expression, the regulated form of the competitive violence whose parameters the conventions specified for the inter-house conflicts the feudal dynamics produced. The War of Assassins was authorized violence. The convention's framework included the authorization for the inter-house assassination, for the targeted killing the political competition's most concentrated form constituted. The authorization was regulated, was conducted within the parameters the convention specified, was maintained within the conditions the framework's terms encompassed. The regulation included the notification. The War of Assassins' formal requirements included the declaration, the formal notification the aggressing house provided to the targeted house before the assassination's execution. The notification was the regulation's procedural dimension, the requirement whose compliance the convention's framework specified for the warfare's legitimate conduct. The notification was the convention's most paradoxical requirement. The agreement that authorized the killing required the killing's announcement, required the aggressor to inform the target of the aggression the aggressor was planning to conduct. The paradox was the regulation's character, the quality that distinguished the regulated violence from the unregulated violence through the procedural requirements the regulation imposed. The procedural requirements were consequential. The notification gave the target the opportunity, provided the defensive preparation the notification's advance warning permitted, provided the countermeasures the warning's temporal interval enabled. The opportunity was the regulation's product, was generated by the procedural requirements the framework's terms imposed on the aggression the framework authorized. The opportunity's provision was the regulation's most consequential humanitarian quality. The regulation that required the notification was the regulation that provided the target the chance the unregulated aggression would not have included, was the framework that insisted the competitive violence be conducted with the fairness the procedural requirements' compliance constituted. The fairness was relative. The assassination remained the killing, remained the lethal violence, the competitive aggression's concentrated form constituted. The fairness did not eliminate the violence. The fairness regulated the violence, imposed the procedural conditions the violence was conducted within, provided the opportunity the conditions compliance generated. The violence was fair in the procedural sense. The violence was lethal in the substantive sense. The procedural and the substantive were different dimensions of the same activity the framework encompassed. The Harkonnen assault on the Atreides did not comply with the War of Assassins procedural requirements. The assault, the military operation that destroyed the Atreides household on Arrakis, was not conducted through the Canley framework's regulated procedures. The assault was the conspiracy, was the covert operation the Emperor and the Baron had coordinated for the Atreides' destruction without the procedural requirements the Convention's framework specified. The non-compliance was the conspiracy's political vulnerability. The assault whose conduct did not comply with the Convention's procedural requirements was the assault whose legitimacy the non-compliance compromised. The non-compliance was the violation, was the breach of the Convention's terms the procedural requirements non-observation constituted. The violation's consequences were potential rather than actual during the conspiracy's operational period. The Landsraad's response to the violation, the political consequences the non-compliance's exposure would have produced in the political landscape's dynamics, was the response the conspiracy's concealment was designed to prevent. The concealment was the conspiracy's political defense, the mechanism through which the violation's consequences were prevented by the violation's non-detection. Paul's revolution exposed the conspiracy. The revolution's political confrontation, the moment at which the military victory's terms were presented to the political landscape's institutional actors, was the confrontation that exposed the Emperor's participation in the conspiracy the Convention's procedural requirements had not authorized. The exposure was the Convention's enforcement mechanism operating after the fact, the mechanism through which the violation's consequences were produced despite the violation's initial concealment's success. The enforcement was delayed, was produced by the revolution's political events rather than by the Convention's monitoring mechanism's immediate detection. The delay was the enforcement's character in the conspiracy's case, the quality that distinguished the conspiracy's enforcement from the deterrent's immediate enforcement the atomic prohibition's mutual retaliation mechanism provided. Paul's deployment of the atomics at Arrakis deserves the extended examination the deployment's significance demands, the sustained analysis of the decision, the execution, the justification, and the consequences that the Convention's most dramatic violation encompassed. The decision was prescient. The prescient consciousness's assessment of the probability space, the awareness of the options the space contained, and the consequences the options exercise would produce, was the assessment that identified the atomic deployment as the option the space's structure made necessary. The necessity was the assessment's product, was generated by the prescient evaluation of the alternatives the space encompassed and the determination that the alternative's consequences exceeded the deployment's consequences. The necessity was contested. The assessment's conclusion that the atomic deployment was the least terrible option the probability space contained was the conclusion the prescient consciousness produced through the evaluation the ordinary consciousness could not replicate. The ordinary observer could not verify the assessment, could not confirm the prescient evaluation's conclusion through the independent analysis the verification would have required. The verification's impossibility was the decision's most consequential epistemic quality. The quality that made the deployment's justification dependent on the prescient consciousness's credibility rather than on the independent assessment's confirmation. The credibility was Paul's. The person whose prescient consciousness had produced the assessment, whose evaluation of the probability space had generated the conclusion the deployment's justification depended on, was the person whose credibility the justification rested on. The credibility was personal rather than institutional, was the trust the person's capabilities warranted rather than the verification the institutional assessment could provide. The personal character of the credibility was the deployment's most consequential political quality. The deployment that was justified through the prescient consciousness's assessment rather than through the institutional evaluation's verification was the deployment whose legitimacy depended on the assessor's person rather than on the assessment's process. The legitimacy was personal. The consequences were institutional. The personal legitimacy producing the institutional consequences was the dynamic the convention's framers had not anticipated, the situation the convention's enforcement architecture was not designed to address. The execution was military. The atomics were deployed against the shield wall, against the geological formation whose destruction the Fremen assault's tactical requirements specified. The deployment's targeting was directed at the rock rather than at the personnel, was aimed at the geological feature rather than at the human targets the convention's prohibition encompassed. The targeting distinction was the deployment's legal argument. The argument said the convention prohibits the use of atomics against human targets. The deployment targeted the geological formation. The geological formation is not a human target. The deployment did not violate the convention's prohibition. The argument's logic was sound in the narrow dimension the argument's scope encompassed. The convention's language prohibited the use against human targets. The targeting was directed at the rock. The language and the targeting were consistent. The language prohibited the human targeting. The targeting was geological. The argument's logic was questionable in the broader dimension the argument's scope excluded. The deployment's purpose was the breach. The breach's purpose was the assault. The assault's target was the personnel. The geological targeting served the personnel targeting purpose. The distinction between the geological targeting and the personnel targeting purpose was the distinction whose narrowness the broader assessment would have questioned. The questioning was not conducted. The revolution's military success, the Fremen assault's overwhelming defeat of the Harkonnens' Sardaukar defensive force, produced the political conditions under which the questioning's institutional mechanisms could not operate. The military victory's comprehensiveness made the questioning moot, made the assessment of the deployment's convention compliance irrelevant to the political landscape the victory had transformed. The mootness was the convention's enforcement's most consequential limitation in the deployment's case. The convention whose enforcement depended on the political landscape's institutional mechanisms was the convention whose enforcement could not operate when the political landscape's institutional mechanisms were overwhelmed by the military reality the enforcement was supposed to address. The political consequences of Paul's atomic deployment were the consequences the deployment produced in the convention's institutional dimension, the effects the violation generated in the agreement's political authority. The consequences were paradoxical. The deployment that should have triggered the convention's enforcement, that should have produced the collective retaliation the mutual deterrence guaranteed, did not trigger the enforcement. The enforcement was not activated because the political conditions the revolution's military success had produced were the conditions the enforcement's mechanisms could not operate within. The non-activation was the convention's most consequential institutional failure. The agreement whose enforcement the mutual deterrence was supposed to guarantee was the agreement whose enforcement the military reality's overwhelming force prevented. The deterrent that was supposed to prevent the violation was the deterrent that could not operate when the violation was accompanied by the military superiority the deterrence activation could not overcome. The failure demonstrated the deterrent's limitation. The deterrent worked against the violator whose military capability the collective retaliation could overwhelm. The deterrent did not work against the violator whose military capability the collective retaliation could not overwhelm. The limitation was the deterrent's structural quality, the quality that made the enforcement effective against the weak and ineffective against the strong. Paul was strong. The Fremen army's military capability, enhanced by the Fremen's environmental conditioning, motivated by the messianic identification's religious fervor, guided by the prescient consciousness's strategic direction, was the capability the collective retaliation's military force could not overwhelm. Paul was too strong for the deterrent. The deterrent's enforcement was calibrated for the violator the collective force could overcome. The deterrent's enforcement was not calibrated for the violator the collective force could not overcome. The non-calibration was the Convention's design's most consequential oversight. The Convention's designers, the post-jihad settlements architects whose institutional design the Convention constituted, had designed the enforcement for the violator whose capability the collective response could manage. The designers had not designed the enforcement for the violator whose capability exceeded the collective response's management. The oversight was the design's gap, the gap between the enforcement's calibrated capability and the violator's actual capability that the deployment's events demonstrated. The gap was filled by Paul's political authority. The person whose military capability exceeded the deterrence enforcement was the person whose political authority replaced the deterrence enforcement with the personal authority the prescient consciousness's credibility provided. The personal authority said the deployment was necessary. The prescient consciousness's assessment said the alternatives were worse. The political landscape accepted the personal authority's assertion because the political landscape could not challenge the personal authority's military capability. The acceptance was the Convention's post-deployment condition. The Convention was not formally revoked. The agreement was not declared terminated. The prohibition was not formally rescinded. The Convention persisted, was maintained in the institutional framework's formal dimension alongside the deployment's accomplished facts practical dimension. The coexistence was the Convention's post-Paul status. The agreement that formally prohibited the atomic's use against human targets coexisted with the accomplished fact of the atomic's use against the geological target, the prohibition's targeting distinctions narrow logic permitted. The formal prohibition and the accomplished fact were both present, both dimensions of the Convention's institutional condition in the post-deployment period. The shield technology was the Convention's defensive architecture, the protective technology whose ubiquitous deployment was both the product of and the contributor to the Convention's warfare-related framework. The Holtzman shield was the personal defense. The technology, the energy field, the Holtzman effects physics generated provided the protection, the personal defense the combat's participants maintained. The shield deflected the fast-moving objects, stopped the projectiles, the high-velocity impacts, the kinetic attacks the unshielded body's vulnerability would have sustained. The shield's defensive capability was the warfare's character's determinant. The defense that stopped the kinetic attacks was the defense that eliminated the ranged kinetic warfare from the combat's effective methods, that removed the projectile weapon's effectiveness from the tactical options the combat's planning encompassed. The shields made the projectiles ineffective. The ineffectiveness removed the projectiles from the warfare. The removal changed the warfare. The changed warfare was the blade warfare, the combat whose methods the shield's defensive capabilities limitations permitted was the combat the slow blade's technique encompassed. The close quarters engagement, the edged weapon's controlled penetration of the shield's filtration characteristics made effective. The blade combat was the convention's framework's most visible martial expression. The fighting form the convention's weapons-related dimensions and the shield technology's physical characteristics combined to produce. The blade combat shaped the culture. The martial traditions the Imperium's noble houses maintained, the fighting forms the house's military training developed, the combat arts the house's martial cultures sustained, were shaped by the blade combat the shield technology's characteristics required. The traditions were blade-focused. The traditions were skill-intensive. The traditions valued the individual combat capability the blade technique's mastery constituted. The individual capability's valuation was the convention's cultural contribution to the warfare's character. The convention whose weapons prohibitions shaped the warfare's methods, alongside the shield technology's physical limitations, was the convention whose cultural influence produced the martial culture, the weapon's character, and the shield's properties combined to generate. The martial culture was aristocratic. The blade combat that the individual capability's mastery constituted was the combat that the aristocratic culture's values, the personal honor, the individual prowess, the martial excellence the nobility's traditions sustained, could celebrate, and the aristocratic identity could be organized around. The blade combat was the aristocratic warfare, was the fighting form the aristocratic values could endorse, and the aristocratic culture could sustain. The aristocratic character was the convention's most consequential cultural product. The convention that prohibited the mass destruction weapons and that the shield technology supplemented with the personal defense was the convention that produced the warfare whose character the aristocratic culture could accommodate, the warfare whose methods the individual combat skill-based character constituted, and the aristocratic values emphasis on the personal excellence could celebrate. The accommodation was the convention's cultural achievement. The civilization that needed the warfare, that required the competitive violence the feudal framework's political dynamics generated, managed the warfare through the convention's prohibitions and the shield technology's characteristics into the form the civilization's aristocratic culture could sustain. The management was the achievement. The conversion of the warfare from the mass destruction form the technology's unrestricted deployment would have produced into the individual combat form the convention's prohibitions and the shield's limitations created. The poison was the convention's most frequently deployed regulated weapon, the substance whose use the convention's framework managed within the parameters the regulation specified. The poison occupied the Canley's regulated space. The convention's authorization of the interhouse assassination included the authorization of the assassination's methods the regulation's parameters encompassed. The poison was among the methods. Was the substance the assassination's execution could employ within the regulatory framework the convention maintained. The poison's regulated character was the character the convention's framework produced in the substance's deployment. The regulated deployment was the deployment conducted within the framework's terms, within the notification requirements the War of Assassins specified, within the targeting limitations the Canley's combatant-non-combatant distinction imposed, within the procedural conditions the regulation encompassed. The Gon Jabbar was the poison's most culturally significant deployment instrument. The needle, whose poison delivery the Bene Gesserit's tradition maintained for the purposes the sisterhood's institutional practices specified. The Gom Jabbar was not a war weapon, was not the combat instrument the military forces' arsenals included. The Gom Jabbar was an institutional instrument, was the device the sisterhood maintained for the humanity tests administration and the judicial functions the sisterhood's institutional authority encompassed. The Gom Jabbar's most consequential deployment was Elia's killing of the Baron, the preborn child whose consciousness encompassed the ancestral presence's accumulated awareness, deployed the Gom Jabbar against the Baron's flesh, delivered the poison the needle carried into the body the poison would kill. The deployment was not the regulated warfare. The deployment was the personal act, the individual's killing of the individual through the instrument the individual's institutional tradition maintained. The deployment's relationship with the convention's framework was the relationship the personal act's character produced. The relationship between the individual killing and the regulated framework the convention maintained for the interhouse violence's management. The killing was not conducted within the Canley's regulated procedures, was not executed through the War of Assassins' procedural requirements, was not performed within the notification and the targeting the convention's framework specified. The killing was conducted within the battle. The combat's chaotic conditions, the revolution's military operations' immediate environment, were the conditions the killing was performed in. The conditions were the combat's conditions rather than the Canley's conditions. The killing occurred during the warfare rather than during the regulated assassination. The distinction was the convention's framework's assessment subject, the determination of which regulatory category the killing's circumstances placed the killing in. The crysknife deserves examination within the convention's weapons framework because the weapon's sacred character placed the weapon in the convention's cultural dimension alongside the convention's regulatory dimension. The crysknife was the Fremen's sacred weapon. The blade, manufactured from the sandworm's tooth, maintained with the ceremonial attention the Fremen's martial tradition demanded, was the weapon whose cultural significance exceeded the weapon's military significance in the cultural dimension the weapon's treatment encompassed. The crysknife's cultural rules exceeded the convention's regulatory rules. The convention regulated the weapon's deployment. The crysknife's cultural rules regulated the weapon's existence, specified the conditions the weapon's maintenance required, determined the circumstances the weapon's display was permitted in, established the protocols the weapon's handling was conducted through. The rules included the blood rule. The crysknife that was drawn had to be blooded before the weapon was returned to the sheath, had to taste the blood the drawing's occasion the rules specified before the weapon's concealment was restored. The rule was cultural rather than regulatory, was the Fremen tradition's requirement rather than the convention's specification. The cultural rule's relationship with the convention's regulatory framework was the relationship of the parallel systems, the relationship between the cultural regulation the Fremen's tradition maintained and the institutional regulation the convention's framework provided. The systems were parallel, operated alongside each other in the dimensions the respective regulatory authorities encompassed, managed the weapon's deployment through the different mechanisms the different regulatory traditions employed. The parallel operation demonstrated the convention's relationship with the cultural traditions the convention coexisted with. The convention was not the only regulatory system the Imperium's weapons were managed through. The cultural traditions, the Fremen's crysknife rules, the Sardaukars' martial codes, the noble houses' honor-based combat protocols were the additional regulatory systems whose management of the weapon's deployment supplemented the convention's institutional regulation. The supplementation was the weapon's regulatory landscape's character, the quality that made the weapon's management the product of the multiple regulatory systems the institutional and the cultural traditions combined to produce. The Convention regulated the weapons at the institutional level. The cultural traditions regulated the weapons at the cultural level. The two levels combination produced the comprehensive regulation the weapons management encompassed. The Convention across the saga's documented timeline was the Convention whose authority and whose enforcement evolved with the political conditions the timeline's eras produced. The agreement whose institutional character was shaped by the governance the era's events generated. In the Carino era, the 10,000-year governance the dynasty maintained before Paul's revolution. The Convention was the stable agreement. The prohibition was maintained. The deterrent functioned. The mutual assurance was sustained. The atomics were not deployed against human targets. The Convention's enforcement architecture operated within the parameters the architecture's design specified. The stability was the Carino era's Convention-related achievement. The dynasty's governance, whatever the governance's other qualities encompassed, maintained the Convention's institutional authority across the millennia. The governance sustained. The maintenance was the governance's contribution to the civilization's weapons-related regulatory framework. The sustained preservation of the agreement, the civilization's survival, the agreement's architects had assessed the agreement was necessary for. The maintenance was conducted through the political mechanisms the dynasty's governance provided. The emperor's authority, the governance's political leverage the throne's institutional position encompassed, was deployed for the Convention's maintenance alongside the deterrence mutual enforcement the house's arsenals sustained. The emperor's authority reinforced the deterrent, supplemented the mutual retaliation's enforcement with the governance's political enforcement the throne's authority provided. The reinforcement was the Carino era's enforcement architecture's most consequential quality. The enforcement that combined the deterrence mutual mechanism with the governance's political mechanism was the enforcement whose comprehensiveness exceeded what either mechanism alone could have provided. The deterrent enforced through the retaliation's assurance. The governance enforced through the authority's political consequences. The combination was the comprehensiveness, the enforcement's comprehensive character the two mechanisms' combination produced. In Paul's era, the Convention was challenged. The atomic deployment at Arrakis, the targeting distinction's narrow deployment against the geological formation, was the challenge that tested the Convention's authority in the circumstances the challenge's military and political context produced. The challenge was not resolved through the Convention's enforcement. The enforcement that the challenge should have triggered, the collective retaliation the mutual deterrence guaranteed, was not activated. The non-activation was the enforcement's failure, the military reality's overwhelming force produced in the enforcement's institutional mechanisms. The failure did not terminate the Convention. The agreement persisted through the failure, was maintained in the institutional framework's formal dimension despite the enforcement's practical failure in the deployment's circumstances. The persistence was the Convention's institutional resilience, the quality that maintained the agreement's formal authority despite the agreement's practical enforcement's failure. In the God Emperor's era, the Convention was managed alongside every other dimension of the civilization's institutional landscape the comprehensive governance encompassed. Leto the Kend managed the weapons. The God Emperor's comprehensive governance, the 3,500-year management the transformation's physical form permitted, included the weapons management in the governance's comprehensive scope. The management encompassed the atomics, encompassed the family arsenals the houses maintained, the deterrent the arsenal's mutual possession sustained, the Convention the deterrent enforced. The management was personal. The God Emperor managed the weapons through the personal authority the governance's comprehensiveness provided, managed the arsenal's maintenance, the deterrence operation, the convention's enforcement through the authority the throne's comprehensive position encompassed. The personal management changed the convention's character. The agreement that had been sustained through the mutual deterrence, through the enforcement the house's mutual possession of the atomic arsenals provided, was converted to the agreement sustained through the personal authority, through the enforcement the God Emperor's comprehensive governance provided. The conversion was the convention's most consequential institutional transformation during the saga's documented timeline. The agreement whose enforcement mechanism was the mutual deterrence was the agreement whose enforcement mechanism became the personal authority. The mutual and the personal were different mechanisms. The mutual was the collective enforcement the distributed arsenals produced. The personal was the individual enforcement the comprehensive governance provided. The different mechanisms produced the different characters. The convention, enforced through the mutual deterrence, was the convention whose authority was the collective's authority. The agreement whose maintenance was the collective's maintenance, whose enforcement was the collective's enforcement. The convention enforced through the personal authority was the convention whose authority was the individual's authority. The agreement whose maintenance was the individual's maintenance, whose enforcement was the individual's enforcement. The individual enforcement was more comprehensive, but more fragile. The God Emperor's personal authority encompassed every dimension the convention's enforcement required, encompassed the weapons management, the arsenal's control, the violations prevention, with the comprehensiveness the personal authority's scope provided. The comprehensiveness exceeded the mutual deterrence's coverage. The fragility exceeded the mutual deterrence's durability. The personal authority depended on the person. The person was mortal, or in the God Emperor's case, was terminable. The termination would terminate the enforcement. The termination occurred. The God Emperor's death, the biological event the Idaho River's water produced in the sandworm hybrid body, terminated the personal authority the convention's enforcement depended on during the God Emperor's era. The termination was the enforcement cessation, the end of the personal management the convention's institutional maintenance had relied on. The cessation produced the famine times weapons dimension. The period after the God Emperor's death, the period during which the political landscape fragmented and the institutional frameworks the governance had maintained were disrupted, was the period during which the convention's enforcement was reduced to the mechanisms the fragmented landscape could sustain. The reduced enforcement was the convention's post-God Emperor condition. The agreement whose enforcement the personal authority had comprehensively provided was the agreement whose enforcement the fragmented landscape's reduced mechanisms could only partially sustain. The partial sustainability was the enforcement's diminished condition. The reduced capacity the fragmented landscape's institutional resources provided for the convention's maintenance. The Honored Mattress's weapons capabilities were the capabilities that introduced the convention's most dramatic post-scattering challenge, the challenge that the returning faction's combat methods posed to the convention's framework the old Imperium's institutional landscape maintained. The Honored Mattres possessed destructive capabilities that exceeded the old Imperium's conventional military capabilities. The faction that returned from the scattering's unknown territories, that emerged from the conditions the old Imperium's experience had not encompassed, possessed the weapons and the combat methods the old Imperium's military landscape had not developed. The capabilities included the orbital destruction, the Honored Mattress capacity for the planetary-level devastation, the ability to destroy the Bene Gesserit installations, The capacity to devastate the institutional infrastructure the sisterhood maintained was the capability the convention's framework had not anticipated from a source the framework had not encompassed. The non-anticipation was the convention's most consequential post-scattering limitation. The agreement that had been designed for the old Imperium's institutional actors, for the houses, the institutions, the governance's political participants, the agreement's framework encompassed, was the agreement whose scope did not include the actors the scattering's unknown territories had produced. The non-inclusion was the scope's limitation. The convention's scope encompassed the old Imperium's actors. The convention's scope did not encompass the scattering's products. The honoured matres were the scattering's product. The honoured matres were outside the convention's scope. The outside-ness was the convention's applicability's boundary, the edge beyond which the agreement's authority did not extend and the agreement's enforcement did not operate. The boundary's existence raised the question the saga's final documented period's events posed: could the convention's authority be extended to the actors the scattering had produced? Could the agreement's scope be expanded to encompass the factions the agreement's original design had not included? Could the enforcement be applied to the persons the enforcement's mechanisms had not been designed for? The questions were not answered. The saga's final documented events did not provide the answers the question's resolution required, did not document the convention's expansion or the convention's failure to expand to encompass the scattering's products. The questions remained: were the open dimensions the saga's documentation left for the reader's assessment? The honoured matress's violence was the violence the convention could not regulate. The faction's destructive deployments, the installation's devastation, the population's targeting, the aggressive expansion the faction's institutional operations constituted, were the violence the convention's regulatory framework could not manage because the framework's scope did not encompass the faction the violence emanated from. The unregulated violence was the convention's failure's most visible expression. The agreement that had regulated the old Imperium's warfare across the millennia the agreement's enforcement had sustained was the agreement that could not regulate the warfare the scattering's returning factions introduced. The failure was the scope's failure, the limitation the agreement's original design had imposed on the agreement's applicability. The philosophical argument about the limits of violence was the argument the convention embodied. The argument about the relationship between the civilization and the violence the civilization's competitive dynamics produced. The argument said the civilization that produces the violence must limit the violence. The competitive dynamics the civilization's political framework sustains, the rivalries, the conflicts, the hostilities the feudal system's competitive character generates, produce the violence the dynamics resolution requires. The violence is the dynamics product. The violence must be limited because the unlimited violence would destroy the civilization the dynamics operate within. The limitation was the convention. The agreement that specified the weapons the violence could not employ, that prohibited the atomics, the biological agents, the mass destruction technologies the unrestricted violence might have deployed, was the agreement that implemented the limitation the civilization's survival required. The argument extended beyond the weapons to the methods. The convention's Canley framework, the regulation of the interhouse warfare's conduct through the procedural requirements the framework specified, was the limitation's extension from the weapons to the methods. The weapons limitation said, the violence may not employ these weapons. The methods limitation said, the violence may not employ these methods. The two limitations combined to produce the comprehensive regulation the violence's management required. The comprehensiveness was the argument's ambition. The argument said the violence can be managed. The violence can be regulated. The civilization can sustain the competitive dynamics the political framework produces while managing the violence the dynamics generate within the parameters the civilization's survival requires. The ambition was tested across the saga's timeline. The convention's enforcement was tested by Paul's atomic deployment. The convention's authority was tested by the God Emperor's personal management. The convention's scope was tested by the honored mattress's unregulated violence. The testing was the ambition's sustained examination, the ongoing assessment of whether the violence's management the convention constituted was the management the civilization's evolving conditions could sustain. The assessment's conclusion was mixed. The convention managed the violence successfully during the Carino era, sustained the regulation across the millennia the stable governance maintained. The convention managed the violence unsuccessfully during the transitions, failed to enforce the prohibition during Paul's deployment, failed to sustain the enforcement during the post-God Emperor fragmentation, failed to encompass the violence the scattering's products introduced. The mixed conclusion was the argument's most consequential finding. The finding said, the violence can be managed during the stability. The violence cannot be managed during the transitions. The management's effectiveness is contingent on the conditions the management is conducted within. The stable conditions support the management. The transitional conditions undermine the management. The contingency was the argument's most consequential dimension. The argument that said the violence could be managed was the argument whose conclusion was contingent on the conditions the management operated within. The conclusion was conditional rather than absolute, was the finding that the management worked when the conditions permitted and failed when the conditions did not. The conditional character was the convention's most consequential philosophical quality. The agreement that managed the violence conditionally, that sustained the regulation during the stability and failed the regulation during the transitions, was the agreement whose philosophical character the conditionality constituted. The convention was not the permanent solution. The convention was the conditional management. The management worked when it worked. The management failed when it failed. The weapons relationship with the feudal framework was the relationship that connected the destructive technologies the weapons constituted to the political system the technologies were deployed within. The relationship between the violence's instruments and the violence's institutional context. The feudal framework produced the violence. The system's competitive character, the rivalries, the conflicts, the hostilities the house's competitive dynamics generated, was the character that produced the violence the convention regulated. The framework was the violence's source. The convention was the violence's management. The source and the management coexisted, were both the civilization's institutional dimensions, were both the political landscape's structural features. The coexistence was the civilization's most consequential institutional relationship. The framework that produced the violence and the agreement that managed the violence were both present in the same institutional landscape, were both operating in the same political environment, were both contributing to the same civilization's institutional character. The production and the management were simultaneous. The simultaneity was the relationship's character. The simultaneity produced the tension. The framework that produced the violence operated continuously, generated the competitive dynamics the hostilities expressed, sustained the rivalries the conflicts manifested. The convention that managed the violence operated continuously alongside, sustained the regulation the management constituted, maintained the enforcement the prohibition provided. The continuous production and the continuous management were the tension's dimensions, the two forces whose ongoing operation the tension's sustained character constituted. The production pushed toward the violence's expansion. The management pushed toward the violence's containment. The expansion and the containment were the opposing forces whose sustained interaction the tension's ongoing presence maintained. The tension was the convention's operational environment. The convention operated within the tension, sustained the management's containment against the production's expansion, maintained the regulation's parameters against the dynamic's pressures. The operation was sustained, was maintained across the millennia the convention's enforcement encompassed, was conducted through the mechanisms the enforcement's institutional architecture provided. The sustained operation was the convention's achievement. The agreement that maintained the management against the production across the millennia the operation encompassed was the agreement whose sustained operation constituted the achievement the convention represented. The achievement was not the violence's elimination. The achievement was the violence's management, the sustained containment of the violence within the parameters the civilization's survival required. The management, rather than the elimination, was the convention's most consequential philosophical quality. The convention did not attempt the violence's elimination, did not try to remove the violence from the civilization's institutional dynamics, did not seek to abolish the competitive aggression the feudal framework produced. The convention attempted the violence's management, sought to contain the violence within the parameters, attempted to regulate the aggression within the limits. The management rather than elimination reflected the convention's architect's assessment of the violence's institutional character. The assessment concluded, the violence is the feudal framework's product. The feudal framework is the civilization's political structure. The civilization's political structure cannot be changed without the change the civilization's transformation would constitute. The violence cannot be eliminated without the framework's transformation. The framework's transformation is not available. The violence must be managed rather than eliminated. The conclusion was realistic. The convention's architects who concluded the violence must be managed rather than eliminated were the architects whose realism the conclusion reflected, whose assessment of the political landscape's institutional character produced the conclusion the landscape's structural features supported. The realism was the convention's foundation. The agreement that was built on the realistic assessment that was designed for the management rather than the elimination the assessment concluded was available, was the agreement whose foundation was the realism the assessment constituted. The foundation was solid, sustained the convention across the millennia the foundation supported. The foundation was also limited, confined the convention to the management the realism's conclusion permitted, rather than aspiring to the elimination the idealism's conclusion might have pursued. The forbidden weapons of Dune were the weapons the convention's prohibition encompassed, the destructive technologies whose deployment the agreement's terms restricted, and whose use the enforcement's mechanisms prevented. The weapons were forbidden, because the weapons were destructive. The destructive capability the weapons encompassed, the damage the weapons could produce, the devastation the weapons' deployment would generate, the consequences the weapons' use would impose, was the capability the civilization's survival could not accommodate the unrestricted deployment of. The weapons were also maintained because the weapons were deterrent. The arsenals the houses preserved, the atomic stockpiles the mutual deterrence's architecture required, were the weapons whose maintenance the deterrent the maintenance sustained. The maintained but forbidden character was the weapon's institutional condition, the condition of the presence without the use, the possession without the deployment, the capability without the exercise, The condition was the convention. The maintained but forbidden was the convention's content, was what the agreement specified, was what the prohibition and the maintenance combined to produce. The convention said, maintain the weapons. The convention said, do not use the weapons. The two instructions were the convention's dual content, the dual specification the agreement imposed on the weapons the agreement encompassed. The dual content was the convention's most consequential institutional quality. The agreement that specified the maintenance and the non-use simultaneously was the agreement whose institutional character the dual specification constituted. The maintenance ensured the deterrent. The non-use ensured the survival. The deterrent and the survival were both the agreement's products, were both generated by the dual specification the agreement imposed. The products justified the agreement. The deterrent that prevented the deployment and the survival that the non-deployment sustained were both the justifications the agreement's maintenance warranted. The justification was dual, was the twin benefit the dual specification produced, was the combined product the maintenance and the non-use generated. The twin benefit was the convention's ultimate argument. The argument said, the agreement produces the deterrent and the survival simultaneously. The deterrent prevents the deployment. The survival persists through the non-deployment. The two benefits justify the agreement. The agreement should be maintained, because the benefits the agreement produces are the benefits the civilization's continued existence requires. The argument was the convention's final word. The final word was, maintain the agreement. The maintenance produces the deterrent. The deterrent prevents the deployment. The prevention produces the survival. The survival justifies the maintenance. The cycle was complete. The argument was circular. The circularity was the argument's strength. The self-reinforcing logic the convention's sustained operation across the millennia had demonstrated was sustainable. The forbidden weapons of Dune. The Great Convention. The agreement about the violence's limits. The management of the destructive technologies, the regulation of the competitive aggression, the prohibition that maintained the weapons while preventing the weapons' use. The convention was the civilization's most consequential agreement about itself, the determination the civilization made about the violence the civilization would tolerate and the violence the civilization would not. The determination was maintained across the millennia. The determination was challenged during the transitions. The determination was the civilization's commitment to its own survival, expressed through the weapons the commitment managed and the violence the commitment contained. The forbidden weapons remained forbidden. The convention remained maintained. The civilization survived. The agreement held. Until it was tested. When it was tested, the agreement's conditional character was revealed. The stability sustained the agreement. The transitions challenged it. The agreement's authority depended on the conditions the agreement operated within. The forbidden weapons of Dune. The Great Convention explained. The agreement about the violence, the management of the weapons, the regulation of the warfare, the limitation of the destruction, the civilization's most consequential commitment to itself, the lasgun technology, was the directed energy weapon the Imperium's military forces deployed as the ranged combat's primary instrument, the weapon whose operational mechanics and whose tactical employment the Convention's warfare framework encompassed alongside the prohibited weapons the framework's core prohibitions addressed. The lasgun was not prohibited. The weapon's deployment was not encompassed by the Convention's prohibitions, was not included in the agreement's terms the atomic and the biological prohibitions constituted. The lasgun was the permitted weapon, Was the directed energy device the convention's framework authorized for the combat the feudal dynamics competitive violence generated? The permission was qualified by the shield interaction. The lasgun, whose deployment the convention authorized, was the weapon whose interaction with the Holtzman shield produced the nuclear scale detonation the interaction's physics generated. The qualification was practical rather than regulatory, was imposed by the interaction's consequences rather than by the convention's terms. The convention did not prohibit the lasgun shield engagement. The physics prohibited the lasgun shield engagement through the mutual destruction the engagement produced. The physics was the prohibition. The nuclear scale detonation the lasgun shield contact generated, the explosion whose destructive force approached the atomic weapon's destructive capability. Was the consequence the physics imposed on the engagement the convention's regulatory framework did not address? The consequence was the prohibition, was the functional prevention the physics' destructive consequences, sustained in the absence of the regulatory prevention the convention's terms might have provided. The functional prohibition was more effective than the regulatory prohibition would have been. The regulatory prohibition's enforcement depended on the institutional mechanisms the enforcement's architecture provided, depended on the monitoring, the detection, the retaliation the enforcement's operation required. The functional prohibition's enforcement depended on the physics, depended on the consequence the engagement's operation automatically generated, regardless of the institutional mechanism's effectiveness. The automatic generation was the functional prohibition's most consequential quality. The physics that produced the nuclear scale detonation produced the consequence automatically, generated the destructive result without the institutional intervention the regulatory prohibition's enforcement required. The automaticity made the prohibition self-enforcing, made the consequences production independent of the institutional mechanism's operation, made the prevention's effectiveness independent of the enforcement's institutional reliability. The self-enforcement was the lasgun shield interaction's most consequential convention-related quality. The prohibition that enforced itself, that produced the deterrent consequence through the physics' automatic operation rather than through the institution's managed enforcement, was the prohibition whose effectiveness exceeded the institutional prohibition's effectiveness by the margin the automaticity's reliability exceeded the institution's reliability. The shield technology's detailed mechanics illuminated the convention's warfare dimension in the technology's contribution to the warfare's character, the contribution the shield's physical characteristics made to the combat form the convention's framework sustained. The Holtzman shield operated through the Holtzman effect. The physics, the energy field the effect's engineering produced, created the barrier the defense constituted. The barrier's characteristics were the shield's defining qualities, the qualities that determined the barrier's defensive capability and that shaped the combat the barrier's presence influenced. The barrier was speed selective. The shield admitted the slow-moving objects while deflecting the fast-moving objects, filtered the approaching objects through the speed-based criterion the barrier's physics applied. The slow-moving objects penetrated the shield. The fast-moving objects were deflected by the shield. The filtration was the barrier's most consequential physical quality for the combat's character, the quality that determined what the shield defended against and what the shield admitted. The speed selectivity shaped the combat. The fighters whose engagement the shield encompassed fought with the slow blade technique, with the controlled, deliberate, precision-oriented movements the shield's speed criterion permitted. The technique was the shield's product, was generated by the barrier's physical characteristics through the combat adaptation the characteristics required. The technique was skilled. The slow blade's controlled penetration of the shield, the deliberate, managed movement the barrier's speed criterion admitted, required the skill the training's sustained practice developed. The skill was the technique's prerequisite, was the capability the combat method's execution demanded, and the training's sustained investment produced. The skill requirement elevated the combat's character. The fighting that required the skill, that demanded the training, the practice, the sustained development the technique's execution encompassed, was the fighting whose character the skill's requirement elevated above the combat the unskilled violence would have constituted. The elevation was the shield's contribution to the warfare's quality, the quality the technology's characteristics produced in the combat the technology influenced. The elevation was also the convention's contribution, the convention whose prohibitions eliminated the mass destruction weapons from the warfare's methods contributed to the warfare's elevation alongside the shield's contribution. The convention's prohibitions removed the indiscriminate destruction. The shield's characteristics required the individual skill. The removal and the requirement combined to produce the elevated warfare the convention's framework and the shield technology's characteristics sustained. The atomic weapons mechanics were the mechanics the convention's core prohibition addressed, the destructive technology whose operational physics the prohibition prevented from being deployed against the human targets the prohibition specified. The atomic's destructive mechanism was the nuclear reaction. The weapon's operational physics, the energy released the nuclear processes generated through the reactions the weapon's engineering initiated, produced the destructive force the weapon's deployment would have directed against the targets the deployment encompassed. The destructive force was enormous. The energy the nuclear reaction's physics generated, the blast, the heat, the radiation the reaction's products encompassed, was the force whose magnitude exceeded the conventional weapon's destructive capability by the orders of magnitude the nuclear physics energy release produced. The magnitude was the prohibition's motivation. The convention prohibited the atomics because the atomic's destructive magnitude exceeded the civilization's tolerance, because the devastation the deployment would produce was the devastation the civilization's continued existence could not accommodate. The accommodation's impossibility was the prohibition's assessment. The convention's architects assessed the atomic's destructive magnitude against the civilization's tolerance for the destruction. The assessment concluded the magnitude exceeds the tolerance. The exceedance is the prohibition's justification. The prohibition is the civilization's response to the exceedance the assessment identified. The assessment was rational. The civilization whose survival depended on the world's habitable conditions, whose existence required the planetary environments the civilization's populations inhabited, was the civilization whose tolerance for the weapons that could devastate the world's conditions was necessarily limited. The weapons whose deployment could render the worlds uninhabitable were the weapons whose deployment the civilization's survival could not accommodate. The accommodation's impossibility extended to the ecological dimension. The weapons whose deployment could devastate the planetary ecologies, whose destructive effects could damage the biological systems the planetary environments maintained, were the weapons whose deployment the ecological conditions the civilization depended on could not sustain. The ecological dimension was the convention's environmental argument. The argument said, the weapons threaten the ecologies. The ecologies sustain the civilizations. The civilizations depend on the ecologies. The weapons deployment threatens the dependencies. The threats to the dependencies are the threats the civilization cannot accommodate. The environmental argument's application to Arrakis was the argument's most consequential application. The weapons whose deployment could devastate the Arrakis ecology, whose destructive effects could damage the sandworm life cycle the spice production depended on, were the weapons whose deployment the civilization's most consequential ecological dependency could not sustain. Paul's atomic deployment at Arrakis was assessed against the environmental argument alongside the targeting argument. The deployment's effects on the shield wall, the geological formation the deployment targeted, were the effects the environmental argument encompassed alongside the targeting argument's assessment. The deployment's geological effects, the shield wall's destruction, were the environmental effects the deployment produced in the planetary geology the effects encompassed. The geological effects were limited. The deployment targeted the formation. The deployment did not target the ecology. The ecology, the sandworm life cycle the spice production depended on, was not the deployment's target, and was not directly affected by the deployment's geological effects. The limitation was the deployment's environmental defense, the argument that the deployment's effects were geological rather than ecological, that the formation's destruction did not damage the life cycle the production depended on. The defense was the environmental argument's narrow application. The deployment's effects were assessed against the ecology's damage rather than against the geology's damage. The assessment concluded the ecology was not damaged. The conclusion supported the deployment's environmental defense. The defense was added to the targeting defense, was the second defense the deployment's advocates could present alongside the targeting argument the deployment's legal justification encompassed. The Convention's relationship with each major faction was the relationship the Convention's framework produced in the institutional interactions the factions' political activities generated. The different institutional engagements with the Convention the factions' varying institutional characters constituted. The Carino dynasty's relationship with the Convention was the relationship of the enforcer. The dynasty, whose governance maintained the Convention's institutional authority across the millennia the governance encompassed, was the institution whose relationship with the Convention was the enforcement's relationship. The sustained institutional commitment to the Convention's maintenance the dynasty's governance constituted. The enforcement was the dynasty's institutional interest. The Convention whose maintenance the dynasty administered was the Convention whose maintenance served the dynasty's political purposes, maintained the balance the dynasty's governance depended on, sustained the political landscape the dynasty's authority managed, preserved the institutional conditions the dynasty's rule operated within. The interest alignment between the Convention's maintenance and the dynasty's political purposes was the enforcement's motivation. The dynasty enforced the Convention because the Convention served the dynasty. The service was the motivation. The motivation sustained the enforcement. The enforcement maintained the Convention. The Landsraad's relationship with the Convention was the relationship of the participants. The noble houses, whose competitive dynamics the Convention regulated, were the institutions whose relationship with the Convention was the participation's relationship. The sustained institutional engagement with the Convention's terms the houses' competitive activities generated. The participation was dual. The houses participated as the Convention's beneficiaries, benefited from the protection the Convention's prohibitions provided against the mass destruction weapons the unrestricted warfare might have deployed. The houses participated as the Convention's constrained, were limited by the prohibition's restrictions on the weapons the competitive dynamics aggressive deployment might have utilized. The dual participation, the benefiting and the constraining, was the relationship's character. The houses benefited from the Convention. The houses were constrained by the Convention. The benefit and the constraint were both the relationship's dimensions, were both the engagement's qualities the participation, constituted. The Guild's relationship with the Convention was the relationship of the dependent. The institution, whose navigational function depended on the spice, whose operational existence required the substance the Arrakis ecology produced, was the institution whose relationship with the Convention encompassed the concern for the ecological preservation the weapons prohibition contributed to. The ecological preservation was the Guild's Convention-related interest. The Convention's prohibition of the weapons whose deployment could devastate the planetary ecologies, whose destructive effects could damage the biological systems the ecological dependencies encompassed, was the prohibition whose maintenance served the Guild's ecological interest in the Arrakis ecology's preservation. The interest was the dependency's product. The Guild depended on the spice depended on the ecology depended on the protection the Convention's prohibitions contributed to. The chain of dependency ran from the Guild, through the spice, through the ecology, through the Convention, each link contingent on the preceding link's maintenance. The Bene Gesserit's relationship with the Convention was the relationship of the institutional observer. The Sisterhood, whose intelligence network monitored the political landscape's dynamics, whose institutional operations included the assessment of the political actors' activities the intelligence's analysis encompassed, was the institution whose relationship with the Convention included the observation the intelligence provided. The observation served the Sisterhood's assessment. The Bene Gesserit assessed the Convention's condition, evaluated the prohibition's effectiveness, monitored the enforcement's reliability, identified the violations the monitoring's coverage detected. The assessment was the institutional contribution, the intelligence the Sisterhood's operations provided for the Convention's conditions evaluation. The Fremen's relationship with the Convention was the relationship of the outsiders, the desert people whose existence was conducted within the Arrakis ecology the Convention's prohibitions contributed to protecting, but whose institutional position was outside the Landsraad's political framework the Convention was organized within, with a population whose relationship with the Convention was the outsiders' relationship. The outsiders' relationship was the non-participation. The Fremen did not participate in the Convention, did not engage with the agreement's terms as the political actors the agreement encompassed, did not maintain the family atomics the deterrence architecture required, did not observe the Convention's procedural requirements the Canley's framework specified. The non-participation was the position's product. The Fremen were not the Landsraad's members. The Convention was the Landsraad's agreement. The non-membership produced the non-participation. The non-participation produced the non-obligation. The Fremen were not obligated by the Convention because the Fremen were not the Convention's participants. Paul's deployment of the atomics through the Fremen's military structure was the non-obligation's most consequential expression. The deployment that the Convention's participants would have been prohibited from conducting was the deployment the non-participants' military structure conducted. The non-participation's non-obligation was the deployment's institutional defense, the argument that the Fremen's non-participation in the Convention's agreement freed the Fremen from the Convention's prohibition. The defense was additional to the targeting defense and the environmental defense. The deployment's advocates could present three defenses: the targeting defense, the environmental defense, and the institutional defense. The three defenses were the deployment's comprehensive legal argument, the combined justification the deployment's circumstances provided. The Sardakar's role in the Convention's enforcement was the role the Imperial military force played in the governance's management of the Convention's institutional authority, the military dimension of the enforcement the dynasty's political mechanisms administered. The Sardaukar enforced the convention through the military capability the enforcement's credibility required, the force whose combat effectiveness exceeded the conventional military force's capability, whose soldiers' training and whose conditioning the Seleucus Secundus's environmental hardening produced, was the force whose military capability supported the convention's enforcement alongside the deterrent the mutual arsenal's possession sustained. The military support was the enforcement's dimension the deterrent alone did not provide. The deterrent prevented the atomic deployment through the mutual retaliation's assurance. The military support prevented the conventional violations through the governance's military intervention's capacity. The deterrent and the military support were the two enforcement mechanisms, the two dimensions the convention's enforcement architecture encompassed. The Sardaukar's capability was the military support's substance. The force whose combat effectiveness the convention's enforcement's military dimension required was the force the Sardaukar's training produced. The capability sustained the enforcement. The enforcement sustained the convention. The convention sustained the civilization. The chain ran from the Sardaukar through the enforcement, through the convention, through the civilization, each link dependent on the preceding link's maintenance. The Sardaukar maintained the enforcement. The enforcement maintained the convention. The convention maintained the civilization. The chain's disruption, the Sardaukar's defeat at Arrakis, was the enforcement's military dimension's failure. The force whose capability the enforcement's military dimension depended on was the force whose defeat the Fremen's military superiority produced. The defeat removed the military dimension. The removal reduced the enforcement. The reduced enforcement weakened the convention. The weakening was the defeat's convention-related consequence. The convention whose enforcement included the military dimension the Sardaukar's capability sustained was the convention whose enforcement was weakened by the capability's defeat. The defeat was the enforcement's reduction. The reduction was the convention's weakening. The weakening was the civilization's most consequential convention-related military event. The forbidden weapons of Dune occupied the space between the permitted and the prohibited that the convention's framework delineated, the space whose boundaries the agreement's terms specified and whose management the enforcement's mechanisms administered. The space was consequential. The determination of what was permitted and what was prohibited, of which weapons the warfare could employ and which weapons the warfare could not, was the determination that shaped the warfare's character, that defined the combat's methods, that determined the civilization's violence's form. The determination was the convention. The convention was the space's delineation. The delineation was the civilization's most consequential institutional decision about the violence the civilization produced and the violence the civilization tolerated. The decision was maintained across the millennia. The decision was challenged during the transitions. The decision was the civilization's commitment. The commitment was conditional. The commitment held when the conditions permitted. The commitment failed when the conditions overwhelmed the commitment's enforcement. The conditionality was the convention's most honest quality. The agreement that was conditionally maintained, that held during the stability and was challenged during the transitions, was the agreement whose honesty the conditionality constituted. The agreement did not claim the permanence. The agreement's maintenance demonstrated the conditionality. The demonstration was the honesty. The forbidden weapons of Dune. The Great Convention explained. The agreement about the boundaries, the management of the violence, the delineation of the space, the conditional maintenance across the millennia, the civilization's most consequential agreement about the violence the civilization produced. The agreement held until it was tested. The testing was the saga's contribution. The convention was the civilization's answer. The saga asked whether the answer was sufficient. The answer was, conditionally. The personal combat traditions the convention produced were the martial arts the convention's weapons framework, shaped through the framework's restrictions on the methods the combat could employ, the fighting forms the prohibitions, and the shield technology's characteristics combined to generate. The traditions were blade-centric. The martial arts the Imperium's institutional actors maintained were organized around the blade, around the edged weapon, whose slow blade technique the shield's speed filtration permitted, around the close quarters engagement the shield's defensive barriers penetration characteristics required. The blade was the combat's instrument. The technique was the combat's method. The combination was the combat's character. The character was the convention's cultural product. The combat whose character the blade technique and the shield technology produced was the combat the convention's weapons restrictions had helped shape. The fighting formed the prohibition's elimination of the mass destruction methods and the shield's physical characteristics restriction of the ranged kinetic methods combined to generate. The Atreides household maintained the combat tradition with the quality the household's martial culture sustained. The retainers whose combat training the household provided, Gurney Halleck, Duncan Idaho, the other martial practitioners the household encompassed, were the practitioners whose blade technique the training had developed to the levels the tradition's standards demanded. Duncan Idaho was the tradition's most enduring representative. The swordmaster whose combat capability the Atreides tradition valued, whose blade technique the training had developed to the levels the tradition's most demanding standards required, was the practitioner whose presence across the saga's timeline sustained the personal combat tradition's representation across the eras the saga documented. The Gola lineage's sustained presence demonstrated the personal combat tradition's durability. The martial art the tradition encompassed, the blade technique, the combat method, the fighting form the tradition sustained, was maintained across the millennia the Gola lineage's repeated resurrections encompassed. The tradition persisted. The persistence was the martial culture's quality. The quality that made the fighting form the convention's weapons framework had shaped a form whose institutional maintenance exceeded the individual practitioner's biological duration. The Sardaukar maintained the combat tradition with the intensity the military force's institutional demands required. The soldiers whose combat training the Seleucus Secundus conditions developed, whose blade technique the environmental hardening supplemented, were the practitioners whose martial capability the tradition's most demanding institutional expression constituted. The Fremen maintained the combat tradition with the character the desert's conditions shaped, the warriors whose blade technique the desert's conditions developed, whose combat method the shield's absence influenced, whose fighting form the sandworm's attraction's tactical implications modified, were the practitioners whose martial art the convention's framework's absence from the desert's conditions had shaped differently from the traditions the framework's presence had produced. The difference was the ecology's martial contribution. The Fremen's combat tradition, shaped by the shield's absence the sandworm's attraction imposed, by the knife combat the Krisk knife tradition sustained, by the physical conditioning the desert's environmental demands produced, was the tradition the ecology's conditions had shaped rather than the tradition the convention's framework had shaped. The difference produced the advantage. The Fremen's combat tradition developed outside the convention's framework's influence, shaped by the ecology's conditions rather than by the institutional framework's restrictions, produced the combat capability the shielded opponent's tradition-bound expectations could not anticipate. The Fremen fought differently. The difference was the advantage. The advantage was the ecology's gift to the martial tradition the ecology's conditions had produced. The Butlerian Jihad, as the convention's origin story, was the story that connected the convention's establishment to the civilizational trauma the jihad's destruction had produced. The narrative that explained the convention's motivation through the historical experience the motivation was generated by. The jihad destroyed the generations spanning war against the thinking machines, the crusade, the theological conviction, and the political necessity combined to produce, was the war whose destructive scale demonstrated the technology's capacity for the devastation the civilization's survival could not tolerate. The destruction was the lesson. The lesson was the motivation. The motivation was the convention's origin. The origin was traumatic. The convention was born from the trauma, was generated by the civilizational experience of the destruction the jihad produced, was motivated by the determination the trauma's aftermath generated that the destruction should not be repeated. The determination was the trauma's product, was the civilizational resolve the devastation's experience produced in the consciousness the experience had subjected to the devastation's conditions. The trauma informed the convention's character. The agreement whose motivation was the traumatic destruction's non-repetition was the agreement whose character the trauma's intensity shaped. The intensity produced the absoluteness, the prohibition's unconditional character, the trauma's severity generated in the determination the prohibition expressed. The prohibition was absolute because the trauma was severe. The severity demanded the absoluteness. The absoluteness was the severity's institutional expression. The trauma also informed the convention's theology. The prohibition that was inscribed alongside the other prohibitions the Orange Catholic Bible's post-jihad religious framework encompassed, the prohibition against the thinking machine's recreation, the prohibition against the atomic's deployment, was the prohibition whose theological character the religious framework's comprehensive authority provided. The theological character was the convention's durability's source. The prohibition that was maintained through the theological authority alongside the political authority was the prohibition whose maintenance the theological conviction sustained alongside the political calculation. The theological conviction was more durable than the political calculation. The conviction persisted regardless of the political conditions. The calculation adapted to the political conditions. The persistence and the adaptation were different qualities. The persistence was more durable. The durability across the millennia was the theology's contribution. The convention that was maintained for 10,000 years was the convention whose maintenance the theological conviction's durability sustained across the timescales the political calculation's adaptability could not have encompassed alone. The convention, as the arms control analogy, was the dimension that connected the saga's fictional agreement to the actual world's arms control arrangements the saga's readers inhabited. The parallel between the fictional civilization's weapons management and the actual civilization's weapons management, the parallel's structural similarities illuminated. The parallel was structural. The fictional convention and the actual arms control arrangements shared the structural features the parallel encompassed. The mutual deterrence, the verification challenges, the enforcement mechanisms, the conditional effectiveness the arrangement's operational histories demonstrated. The mutual deterrence was the shared feature. The fictional convention's enforcement through the mutual retaliation the distributed arsenals sustained was the feature the actual nuclear deterrence's mutual assured destruction paralleled. The shared feature was the logic, the reasoning that the violation's consequences' magnitude prevented the violation's occurrence through the violator's rational assessment of the consequences' unacceptability. The verification challenges were the shared feature. the fictional convention's enforcement's dependence on the violation's detection. The monitoring that the enforcement's activation required was the feature the actual arms control's verification mechanism's challenges paralleled. The shared feature was the difficulty, the challenge the covert violation's detection posed to the enforcement the detection's reliability sustained. The conditional effectiveness was the shared feature. The fictional convention's effectiveness during the stability and the ineffectiveness during the transitions was the feature the actual arms control's historical experience paralleled. The shared feature was the conditionality, the quality that made the agreement's effectiveness contingent on the conditions the agreements operated within. The parallel was Herbert's commentary. The novelist whose construction of the fictional convention included the structural features the actual arms control arrangements shared was the novelist whose commentary the parallel constituted. The commentary said, the weapons management challenges the fictional civilization faces are the challenges the actual civilization faces. The fictional agreement's conditional effectiveness is the actual agreement's conditional effectiveness. The fictional management's limitations are the actual management's limitations. The commentary was not prescriptive. The parallel did not prescribe the actual civilization's weapons management, did not specify the arrangements the actual civilization should adopt, did not determine the agreements the actual civilization should pursue. The parallel was diagnostic, identified the structural features the weapons management's challenges encompassed, illuminated the conditional character the management's effectiveness demonstrated, described the limitations the management's institutional architecture imposed. The diagnosis was the commentary's purpose. The commentary's purpose was not the solution. The purpose was the understanding, the awareness of the challenges the weapons management presented, the perception of the conditional character the management demonstrated, the comprehension of the limitations the institutional architecture imposed. The convention's relationship with the no-ship technology was the relationship the saga's later novels introduced, the relationship between the weapons agreement and the stealth technology whose capabilities the agreement's enforcement mechanism's effectiveness the technology affected. The no-ships were invisible, the vessels whose stealth technology rendered the ships undetectable by the prescient perception and the conventional detection the monitoring systems employed were the vessels the convention's enforcement mechanisms could not detect. The invisibility was the enforcement's challenge, the convention whose enforcement depended on the violation's detection. And the monitoring that the enforcement's activation required was the convention whose enforcement the invisible vessel's undetectable character challenged. The vessels that could not be detected were the vessels whose weapons deployments could not be monitored. The unmonitored deployments were the deployments the enforcement could not address. The challenge was the technology's most consequential convention-related quality. The stealth that rendered the vessels undetectable was the stealth that rendered the vessel's weapons deployments unmonitorable. The unmonitorability was the enforcement's gap, the space the invisible technology created in the monitoring the enforcement depended on. The gap was the convention's post-no-ship development condition. The agreement whose enforcement the monitoring sustained was the agreement whose enforcement the monitoring's gap weakened. The weakening was the gap's product, the consequence the invisible technology's introduction produced in the enforcement's institutional architecture. The weakening extended the convention's conditional character. The agreement that was effective during the stability and ineffective during the transitions was also the agreement that was effective against the detectable and ineffective against the undetectable. The conditionality's dimensions multiplied, encompassed the temporal dimension and the technological dimension alongside the political dimension the conditionality's original assessment had identified. The Water of Death was the weapon the saga referenced as the ultimate ecological threat, the substance whose deployment would have destroyed the Arrakis ecology the spice production depended on, and whose threatened deployment Paul used as the political leverage the revolution's terms required. The Water of Death was the substance that could kill the sandworm ecology, the biological agent whose deployment would have poisoned the ecological system the sandworm life cycle constituted, would have eliminated the organisms whose biological operations sustained the spice production the civilization depended on, was the agent whose threatened deployment Paul leveraged for the political authority the revolution's military success did not alone provide. The threat was the weapon's deployment. The Water of Death was not deployed, was not released into the ecology the substance would have destroyed. The Water of Death was threatened, was presented as the consequence the non-compliance with Paul's terms would have produced, was offered as the outcome the political resistance to Paul's authority would have generated. The threat worked because the threat was credible. Paul controlled the substance. The Fremen whose cooperation the deployment required were the Fremen whose loyalty Paul's messianic identification sustained. The deployment's consequences, the ecology's destruction, the spice production's cessation, the civilization's navigational and economic systems' collapse were the consequences the political landscape's institutional actors could not afford to produce. The credibility produced the compliance. The political actors whose resistance the threat was directed against assessed the threat's credibility and concluded the compliance the threat demanded was preferable to the consequences the non-compliance would have produced. The assessment was rational, concluded that the compliance's costs were less than the consequence's costs, that the political submission was preferable to the ecological destruction. The Water of Death's relationship with the Convention was the relationship the ultimate weapon's threatened deployment produced in the agreement's institutional framework. The substance whose deployment would have produced the ecological destruction the civilization's survival could not accommodate was the substance the Convention's prohibitions should have encompassed, the weapon whose destructive capability exceeded the atomic weapon's capability in the ecological dimension the substance's effects addressed. The Convention did not address the Water of Death. The agreement whose prohibitions encompassed the atomics, the biological agents, the mass destruction technologies the agreement's terms specified did not encompass the substance whose ecological deployment would have produced the consequences the agreement's motivations should have prevented. The non-address was the Convention's scope's limitation. The agreement that was designed for the weapons the post-Jihad settlement's architects anticipated was the agreement whose scope did not encompass the weapon the architects had not anticipated. The Water of Death was the unanticipated weapon, the substance whose ecological destructive capability the Convention's framers' design had not included in the design's scope. The limitation was the Convention's most consequential design gap in the ecological dimension. The agreement that protected the civilization from the atomic destruction did not protect the civilization from the ecological destruction. The gap between the atomic protection and the ecological protection was the space the Water of Death's threat occupied, the space within which the ultimate ecological weapon could be threatened without the Convention's prohibitions' applicability. The Convention's deepest argument was the argument about the possibility of the violence's management, the sustained examination of whether the civilization's competitive dynamics violence could be managed within the parameters the civilization's survival required. The argument said the management is possible. The evidence was the millennia. The convention maintained the management across the Carino era's 10,000 years, sustained the regulation, maintained the prohibition, preserved the enforcement across the timescale the millennia constituted. The argument also said, the management is conditional. The evidence was the transitions. The convention's enforcement failed during the transitions, failed to prevent the atomic deployment, failed to sustain the enforcement during the fragmentation, failed to encompass the violence the scattering's products introduced. The dual finding, the possible and the conditional, was the argument's conclusion. The conclusion said, the management works when the conditions support the management. The management fails when the conditions overwhelm the management. The conditions determine the management's effectiveness. The conclusion was the convention's most honest assessment. The agreement that assessed its own effectiveness as conditional, that acknowledged the limitations the conditions' variability imposed on the management the agreement constituted, was the agreement whose honesty the conditional assessment constituted. The honesty was the saga's contribution. The saga that documented the convention's conditional effectiveness, that showed the management's success during the stability and the management's failure during the transitions, was the saga whose documentation produced the honest assessment the documentation's comprehensiveness enabled. The documentation was comprehensive. The saga documented the success. The saga documented the failure. The saga documented the conditions. The saga documented the relationship between the conditions and the effectiveness. The comprehensiveness was the documentation's quality. The quality produced the assessment. The assessment was honest. The honesty was the saga's gift, the forbidden weapons of Dune. The Great Convention explained the weapons the agreement prohibited, the enforcement the agreement sustained, the conditions the effectiveness depended on, the transitions the effectiveness failed during, the management the agreement constituted, the limitation the management encompassed, the civilization's agreement about its own violence, the agreement's conditional effectiveness across the millennia. The convention held. Until it was tested, the testing revealed the conditionality. The conditionality was the truth. The truth was the convention. The forbidden weapons remained. The agreement remained. The conditionality remained. The civilization continued. The weapons continued. The management continued. Conditionally.